She had traveled 1,400 miles on all the money she had, believing in a letter that promised a job, a schoolhouse, a new life. But the man who had written that letter had been in the ground for 3 weeks, and the man who sat in his chair now looked at her like a mistake to be corrected quickly. She stood outside a boarding house that night, with no coin left for a room, no one in the town who expected her nowhere at all to go. And then a stranger set money on the counter, without a word of explanation, turned to her and said 7 words that would change the whole course of both their lives. Put her week on my account. This is the story of a woman who refused to let rejection turn her into someone smaller than she was, and a quiet rancher who learned that the truest kindness is the kind that keeps showing up morning after morning until it becomes something no one could ever call anything but love. The stage from Cheyenne came into Buffalo a little after 2 in the afternoon, dust-caked and groaning on its springs, and Josephine Calloway stepped down into air that smelled of sage and hot iron, and something clean coming off the mountains to the west. She had been traveling 4 days. Her back ached in places she hadn't known could ache, and her good gray traveling dress had a film of road dust worked into every seam. But she straightened it anyway, the way she straightened most things, and she looked up at the town that was supposed to be the start of her new life. Buffalo sat low against the foothills of the Bighorns, a scatter of frame buildings and hitching rails along a single wide street, the mountains rising blue and serious behind it. She had read about this town in Ellery Voss's letters for 4 months. He had described the schoolhouse with real affection, a good building, well-built, the children eager and unspoiled. He had described the salary modest but fair, and the small room behind the schoolhouse where she could keep her things. He had written like a man building a bridge for someone he had never met, plank by careful plank, so that she would have somewhere solid to walk when she arrived. She found the hall that served as the town's meeting place easily enough, a low building with school district board painted crookedly above the door. She had her letter of appointment folded inside her reticule, soft now from being read too many times. She knocked, and a man's voice told her to come in, and that was the last ordinary moment of the afternoon. The man behind the table was not Ellery Voss. He was heavier mustached with small pale eyes that moved over her once quickly, the way a man sizes up a horse he has already decided not to buy. Silas Pruitt, he said, introducing himself, chairman of the board now. Mr. Voss had passed 3 weeks back, a fever that came on fast and didn't let go. Josephine felt the words land somewhere behind her ribs, quiet and total. "I'm very sorry to hear that," she said. "I was told he would be expecting me. I have his letter of appointment here if you'd like to see it." Pruitt did not reach for the letter. "That's the trouble of it," he said. Mr. Voss made that arrangement without bringing it before the full board, which he ought to have done, and the board's had time to think it over since. He glanced at the 2 other men seated near the wall, one of whom studied his own hands with great interest. "We've decided the position isn't settled the way you were led to believe." She kept her hands folded in her lap. She had learned over the years that a folded hand did not shake the way a loose one did. "Am I to understand the position no longer exists?" she asked, "or that it exists for someone else?" Pruitt's jaw worked once before he answered. "It exists," he said. "We've just got some reconsidering to do about who's best suited to it." He did not say the words that sat underneath that sentence. He did not have to. She had heard versions of this sentence her whole life, spoken by men who wanted credit for politeness, while withholding the thing politeness was supposed to accompany. She did not argue. She had learned that, too. "I traveled 1,400 miles on the strength of Mr. Voss's word," she said. "I would ask only that the board consider its own word means something as well." Then she rose, thanked them for their time with a courtesy that cost her more than any of them would ever know, and walked back out into the bright, indifferent afternoon. Main Street had not changed in the 10 minutes she'd been inside. Wagons still rolled past. A dog slept in a patch of shade. But everything Josephine had built her plans around had come apart quietly in a small room, without violence, which was somehow worse. She stood on the boardwalk with her single trunk beside her, and understood in the flat way a person understands weather that she had no position, very little money, and nowhere in this town that expected her. She had noticed a man standing near the door of the board office while Pruitt spoke. Tall, sun-browned hat pushed back slightly from his forehead, leaning against the frame with the stillness of someone waiting for something else entirely, and finding himself an unintended witness. He had not spoken. He had not looked away either. When she came out, he was still there, and their eyes met for the length of a breath, before he touched the brim of his hat, not quite a greeting, and walked off toward the livery without a word. She did not know his name. She would learn it before the day was finished. For now, she only knew that someone had watched the worst 10 minutes of her arrival in Wyoming and had said nothing which she took at the time for simple indifference. It would be some while yet before she understood it as something closer to respect, a man giving her the room to carry her own dignity out the door without an audience helping her along. She picked up her trunk herself. It was heavier than it looked, packed with books and a good winter coat, and the small collection of things that had survived her father's death and the long trip west. She started down the street toward the one building with a sign that read, "Rooms," because there was nothing else to do, and because a woman with nowhere to go still had to walk somewhere. The boarding house was called Coil House, a tall clapboard building with a porch that wrapped two sides and a woman behind the front desk who looked like she had spent 30 years deciding not to be surprised by anything. Agatha Coil was somewhere past 50, gray-haired, thick through the shoulders from years of hauling linens and firewood, with eyes that took in a great deal and gave back very little until she'd decided what to do with it. Josephine asked about a room for the night, and Agatha named a price that made something in her chest go tight. The Cattle Association was meeting in town that week, buyers and drovers filling every spare bed for 20 miles, and the price reflected it. Josephine did the arithmetic in her head, the way she had done it on the train, the way she had done it her whole life when circumstances required a woman to be exact about what she could and could not afford. What she had left after the fare and 4 days of station meals would not cover even one night at that price and leave her anything for tomorrow. "I wonder," she said carefully, "if there might be a smaller room, something plainer." "This is the plainest I've got this week," Agatha said, not unkindly. "Just factually. Half of Sheridan's in town for the association meeting. I'd give you a corner of the parlor if I had a corner to spare, but I don't." Josephine understood then, with the same flat clarity she'd felt outside the board office, that she did not have anywhere to sleep that night. She had traveled 1,400 miles and arrived at the exact center of nothing. She kept her spine straight because that was the only thing left she had full control over, and she began quietly to consider her trunk as a pillow and the porch as a bed. That was when the man from the board office came through the door. He had changed nothing about his appearance, still travel-worn, still carrying the unhurried economy of someone used to long distances and short conversation. He nodded to Agatha, said something about a mare he'd left at the livery, needing a look before morning, and then his eyes went to Josephine, standing at the counter with her trunk and her folded hands, and the particular stillness of a person holding herself together through main force of will. He did not ask what had happened. He seemed already to have some working knowledge of it, having stood in that doorway an hour before. He stepped up to the counter beside her, set coins down without ceremony, and said 7 words to Agatha that Josephine would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Put her week on my account," he said. Agatha's eyebrows lifted a fraction, the only visible reaction in a face otherwise arranged for neutrality. Josephine felt heat rise in her face, not shame exactly, something more complicated, gratitude tangled up with the old instinct to refuse anything that looked like charity. "Sir," she said, "I couldn't possibly." "You could," he said. "It's a room, not an obligation." He said it plainly, without warmth exactly, but without coldness, either, the way a man states a fact he expects no argument about. "Name's Thomas Bracken. Folks call me Tom. I run horses out past the Cooley west side of town." "Josephine Calloway," she said, because there was nothing else honest to say. "Mr. Bracken, I intend to repay this." "You can settle that with Agatha directly, if it troubles you," he said. "She keeps better books than I do." Then, before she could answer, he touched his hat again, said something to Agatha about the mare's off foreleg, and walked back out into the evening, the same unhurried way he'd walked in, leaving Josephine standing at the counter with a debt she hadn't asked for and didn't yet understand the shape of. Agatha watched the door close behind him, then looked at Josephine with an expression that had softened considerably in the last 2 minutes. "Well," she said, "that's Tom Bracken for you. Doesn't say 10 words most days, and then he goes and does something like that." "Does he do it often?" Josephine asked. "Pay for strangers' rooms?" Agatha considered the question seriously, the way she seemed to consider most things. "Not that I've seen," she said. "Come on then. I'll get you settled before the supper crowd comes down." The room was small, clean, spare, in the particular way of houses run by women who had no patience for waste. Josephine sat on the edge of the bed once the door closed behind her, and the composure she had held since the board office finally gave way. She did not sob. She was not by nature given to sobbing. But she let the tears come quietly for the position that no longer existed, for the 1,400 miles, for the strange, unearned kindness of a man who had said 7 words and walked away before she could even properly thank him. She did not yet know what Thomas Bracken's kindness would cost either of them. She only knew, lying awake later, with the unfamiliar sounds of buffalo settling outside her window, that for the first time since stepping off the stage she had a roof, and that the roof had come from a stranger who asked for nothing in return. She saw him again on the 3rd morning, which was longer than she expected given what he'd done. She had spent those days walking the length of Main Street, more times than she cared to count, inquiring after any position a respectable woman might hold: a seamstress needing help, a store needing a clerk, anyone needing letters written or accounts kept. Buffalo was not an unkind town exactly, but it was small, and small towns rarely had room for a stranger who arrived without an established place already carved out for her. She was drinking her coffee in Coyle House's kitchen, where Agatha had taken to letting her sit, rather than in the front room with the drovers, when Tom Bracken came through the back door with mud on his boots and a look of a man who had already been up several hours. "Agatha tells me you're still looking for work," he said without preamble. The way she was learning was simply how he spoke. "I am," she said, "though Buffalo appears to have already filled every position a woman might reasonably hold." He considered this, turning his hat in his hands. "I've got 6 men working horses out at my place," he said. "Half of them can't read past their own names, and it costs me every time a bill of sale gets signed wrong or a contract gets misunderstood. I need someone who can teach them evenings after the day's work is done. I've got a room off the tack shed, small but sound. You'd have that and a fair wage while you sort out whatever comes next." Josephine set down her cup carefully. She had learned in 3 days to weigh every offer for what sat beneath it. "Mr. Bracken," she said, "I appreciate the room you've already given me more than I can say. But I find myself wondering why a man who paid a stranger's boarding house bill without being asked would then offer that same stranger employment 3 days later. I would rather understand your reasons than simply accept your generosity." Something in his face shifted. Not offense, something more like respect. "It's not generosity," he said. "I need the work done and you're qualified to do it. That's the whole of my reasoning. He paused. I saw what happened at the board office. I won't pretend that had nothing to do with it. But I'm not offering you charity, Miss Calloway. I'm offering you a job I genuinely need filled. She studied him for a long moment, the plain honesty of his face, the way he did not embellish or perform. All right, she said. I accept. The room off the tack shed was small, exactly as he'd said, but she found when she arrived that afternoon that it had been swept clean, the single window washed, a plain desk set beneath it that had not been there, she suspected, the week before. He said nothing about the desk. She said nothing either, though she noticed, and noticing understood something about him that his sparse words had not yet told her. The ranch itself sat in a shallow valley below a red rock draw the men called Antelope Coulee, a scatter of buildings, a good solid house corrals holding horses that moved with the particular quality of animals well cared for. Bracken Ranch was not large by the standards of the cattle barons in the eastern part of the territory, but it was orderly, everything in its place, the visible product of a man who did not waste motion or material. Her students arrived that first evening, reluctant, embarrassed, several of them, grown men uneasy at admitting what they could not do. She began simply with letters with the alphabet laid out on a slate she'd brought from Tennessee in her trunk, never quite believing she wouldn't need it. A young hand named Eli Vance, no older than 19, sat furthest from the lamp, his shoulders drawn in with the particular shame of a boy who had been mocked for this before. You'll read a full page within the month, she told him, not as encouragement exactly, but as fact, the way she stated most things. He looked up at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice, and something in his posture eased slightly. Tom did not join the lessons. He worked instead at the far end of the barn, close enough to hear the low murmur of her voice through the evening, far enough to leave her the room she needed to do the work properly. She noticed this too. She was beginning to notice a great many things about Thomas Bracken. Small and unannounced, the kind of details that accumulate in a person's attention without permission. Until one evening you realize you have been paying closer attention than you meant to. She walked back to her room after the first lesson, past the corral, where the horses stood dark against the fading light, and thought with something between relief and unease that she had found footing again, however temporary, however strange the ground beneath it. She did not yet know how long that ground would hold. She only knew that for the first time since Ellery Voss's name had been struck from a ledger, she had somewhere useful to stand. Word moved through Buffalo the way it moves through every small town sideways, gathering weight as it traveled, until by the second week the fact of Josephine Calloway teaching hands to read at Bracken Ranch had become in certain mouths something considerably less innocent than it was. It reached Silas Pruitt by way of his own errand boy, who mentioned offhand that Tom Bracken had a colored school teacher living out past the coulee, teaching his men their letters in the evenings. Pruitt received this information the way he received most information that threatened to complicate a decision he'd already made, with a tightening around the eyes and a private satisfaction that he'd been right to keep her out of the schoolhouse. He said nothing publicly for several days. That was not his way. Instead, the information moved through him and out again in smaller currency, a remark here, a raised eyebrow there, until the shape of a rumor had assembled itself without anyone being able to point to where it started. Bracken's got a woman living out at his place. Not married. Not family. Teaching, they say, though who could confirm what really went on out past the coulee alone of an evening? Josephine heard the first version of it from Eli, of all people, who came to his lesson one evening, looking troubled in a way that had nothing to do with his letters. "Ma'am," he said, before she'd even opened the primer, "some of the fellas in town are saying things about you staying out here." I told them it wasn't like that, but I thought you ought to know what's being said. She kept her face steady, though something cold moved through her at the words. "Thank you for telling me, Eli," she said. "I'd rather know than not." She did not tell Tom that night. She was still deciding what, if anything, could be done about talk that fed on itself regardless of what was true, and she did not want to hand him a burden before she'd measured its weight herself. But 2 days later in town, for thread and needles, she felt the change directly. A woman she'd nodded to politely the week before crossed the street rather than pass close by. The clerk at the mercantile Pruitt's own establishment, as it happened, took unusually long fetching her order and did not meet her eyes when he finally brought it. She was standing at the counter waiting when Agatha Coyle came in for her own errands and read the room in a single glance, the particular silence the way 3 women near the door had gone quiet and busy with nothing in particular. Agatha did not lower her voice. "Josephine," she said, warm and deliberately loud, "I've been meaning to ask you about that hem pattern you mentioned. Come sit with me a moment, won't you?" It was a small thing, a woman offering ordinary conversation in a room gone cold, but Josephine felt the weight of it more than she expected to. Agatha walked her to a bench near the window and sat beside her with the settled patience of someone entirely unbothered by who might be watching. "They talk because they've got nothing better to do with their evenings," Agatha said once they were seated. "Don't let it settle in you like it's true just because it's loud." "It isn't fair to Mr. Bracken," Josephine said quietly. "Whatever they're saying, it touches him as much as me." Agatha's expression sharpened slightly. "Tom Bracken's been minding his own business in this town for 15 years, she said. "He doesn't much care what Silas Pruitt's crowd thinks of him, and he never has." She paused, studying Josephine with an attention that felt for a moment uncomfortably direct. "But you're worried about his name more than your own. That's worth noticing." Josephine did not answer that directly. She was not yet ready to examine what sat beneath the worry, the particular shape of it, why Tom Bracken's reputation had come to matter to her, in a way that went beyond simple gratitude for a room and a wage. Instead, she thanked Agatha for the company, finished her errand, and walked back toward the ranch with her purchases, aware of eyes on her back, the whole length of Main Street, aware too in some quieter part of herself that she was no longer entirely certain what she was protecting when she worried over Tom Bracken's name alongside her own. October brought the first sharp cold down off the Bighorn's mornings, when breath hung visible in the barn, and the horses grew thick-coated and restless. The lessons had settled into a rhythm by then, 6 weeks of steady evening work letters, becoming words, becoming sentences. The particular satisfaction of watching a grown man's shoulders straighten as something that had shamed him began slowly to come loose. Eli Vance had come further than any of them. He was quicker than he gave himself credit for, and Josephine had learned to say so plainly, without excessive praise, because he trusted plain statements more than warm ones. He had a mother in Ohio he hadn't written to directly in 3 years, always paying another hand to write for him, ashamed of what his own hand might reveal. One evening in mid-October, after the others had gone to their bunks, Eli stayed behind at the lamp with a scrap of paper he'd been working at privately for a week. He read it aloud to her haltingly at first, and then, with gathering steadiness, a letter to his mother, plain and short, telling her the horses were good this year, and the winter feed was in early, and he was well, and that he loved her, which he had never once managed to say to her directly in all the years he'd been gone. Josephine listened without correcting him, though she caught 2 words reversed near the end, because some things mattered more in the moment than accuracy. When he finished, he looked up at her, and something in his young face had opened that she suspected had been closed a long while. "That's the first thing I ever wrote all the way through myself," he said. "Didn't need anybody else's hand for it." "You did that," she told him. "Not I taught you. You did it." He folded the letter with the careful attention of someone handling something valuable and said goodnight and walked out into the dark toward the bunkhouse with a straighter back than he'd carried in 6 weeks. Josephine sat a moment longer in the lamplight, feeling something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected. Teaching in a tack room could produce the plain, unglamorous, entirely real satisfaction of watching a person's whole understanding of himself shift half an inch toward something better. She became aware, gathering her things, that she was not alone. Tom stood in the doorway, just beyond the reach of the lamp hat in hand, and from his stillness she understood he had been there some minutes, listening to the tail end of Eli's letter, without either of them noticing. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said. "You didn't," she said. Then, because the moment seemed to call for something more honest than politeness, she added, "He wrote to his mother tonight." First time in 3 years, in his own hand. Tom's face did something she hadn't seen it do before, a loosening around the eyes that wasn't quite a smile but was close kin to one. "That boy's been carrying that like a stone since he came to me," he said. 4 years, and I never once thought to ask why he always paid Dutch Harmon to write his letters for him." "You couldn't have known what to ask," Josephine said. "Shame doesn't announce itself." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He looked at her a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, and she felt the weight of that look settle somewhere she hadn't expected, warm and unhurried, entirely unlike the careful distance he usually kept. Then he seemed to catch himself and straightened and said something about checking the water trough before turning in and was gone into the dark. Josephine stood in the tack room a while after he'd left the lamp burning low and admitted to herself something she had been declining to examine for the better part of 6 weeks. She had come to Buffalo believing her life would be built around a schoolhouse that no longer wanted her. Instead, it was being built slowly and without her full permission around a quiet man's ranch, a stubborn boy's letter to his mother, and evenings that had come to matter to her more than she was entirely comfortable admitting. She blew out the lamp and walked back toward her room beneath a sky gone hard and clear with early winter stars, and did not yet have words for what she was feeling. Only the certain knowledge that something in her had shifted since the afternoon she'd stood outside the board office with nowhere left to go. The porch at Bracken Ranch faced west toward the coulee and the last light of evening, and by late October it had become, without either of them deciding it formally, the place where Josephine and Tom sat some nights after the lessons ended, saying little, watching the color drain slowly out of the sky. It was on one such evening, the air sharp enough that she'd wrapped a shawl close around her shoulders, that Tom spoke first, which was itself unusual enough that she gave him her full attention. "There was a woman," he said, 4 years back. "Margaret Aldous. We were set to marry come spring." He paused, turning his hat slowly in his hands, the way he did when choosing words carefully. "She came out from Cheyenne twice to see the place, and both times she left quieter than she'd arrived. Third time she told me straight out she couldn't do it. Said the distance would hollow her out the winters the way a man out here goes silent for days at a stretch working fence line alone. Said she needed more than what this life offered." Josephine sat with that a moment before answering. "Did you believe her?" she asked. "That it was the distance and not something in you?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "I told myself for a long while it was the ranch," he finally said. "Easier to blame the land than to wonder if I was the kind of man a woman couldn't build a life alongside. Quiet the way I am. Slow to say what I'm feeling when I'm feeling anything worth saying." He looked out at the darkening coulee rather than at her. "I stopped asking myself which it was after a time. Seemed safer not to know." Josephine considered her own quiet, then drawing the shawl tighter. "I understand something of that," she said. "Not the same wound, but a cousin to it. I was engaged once in Nashville before my father died. His family decided, once certain difficulties arose with my father's finances, that I was no longer a suitable match, whatever affection had existed between us." She said it plainly, the way she said most difficult things, without asking for sympathy in the saying. "I learned that people will often choose the easier explanation for leaving over the truer, harder one. I don't know that I ever fully forgave myself for believing for a time that it was really about the money, and not simply that I was easy enough to set aside. Tom turned to look at her then, and something in his weathered face had gone very still and very direct. "That wasn't a fair trade you made," he said, "being set aside for something else's convenience." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." She met his eyes in the fading light. "I don't say that to invite pity, Mr. Bracken. Only because you told me something true about yourself, and it seemed dishonest to offer you less in return." He nodded slowly, and for a while neither of them spoke, the silence between them, settling into something that did not feel empty, so much as full, the particular quiet of two people who had each set down something heavy and found the other still sitting there afterward. "You're the first person I've told about Margaret straight through like that," he said finally. "Ben Colby back in Sheridan knows pieces of it. My own family's passed, so there's no one left who'd ask. But I've never laid the whole of it out for anyone the way I just did." "Why now?" she asked, though she suspected she already understood some part of the answer. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "Because you asked whether I believed her reason," he said, "and it was the first time in 4 years anybody's asked me that, instead of just accepting the version I'd settled on for myself." Josephine felt something in her chest loosen, at that warm and unhurried, the same feeling that had moved through her the night Eli read his letter aloud, except larger now and closer to her own life than she was entirely prepared for. She did not reach for his hand. Neither of them reached for anything that evening. But when she rose to go in, she let her fingers rest a moment on the porch rail near where his own hand lay, close enough to be a kind of contact, without quite being one, and he did not move his hand away. "Good night, Tom," she said, using his given name for the first time. "Good night, Josephine," he answered, and something in the way he said it told her he had noticed the change as clearly as she had intended it. The trouble arrived, as trouble in small towns often does, wearing the shape of concern for someone else's welfare. Coraline Rourke, wife of board member Thaddeus Rourke, had never spoken 2 words to Josephine directly, but she had opinions about the arrangement at Bracken Ranch that she shared freely with the women's circle at the Buffalo Community Church, framed always as worry rather than judgment, which made the words harder to refuse and easier to spread. "It isn't proper," she was reported to have said, "a woman living alone that near a bachelor's house, whatever the excuse of teaching might be. Someone ought to think of her reputation if she won't think of it herself." The words traveled the way such words do, arriving at Josephine's second hand through Agatha, who delivered them with visible reluctance and a warning not to let them sit too heavy. But they did sit heavy. Josephine had built her whole adult life around the careful management of exactly this kind of talk, the precise arithmetic of what a woman without family or fortune could and could not afford to have said about her. And she understood with a sinking clarity that Coraline Rourke's concern, however dressed up, threatened 2 things at once: her tenuous standing in a town that had never fully accepted her, and now newly Tom's own good name, which he had carried clean through 15 years in Buffalo before she arrived. She did not tell Tom immediately. She spent 2 days, imrama, turning the problem over the way she turned over any serious problem, without haste, weighing what leaving might cost against what staying might cost him. She had by then admitted to herself what she felt for Thomas. Bracken admitted it plainly, in the quiet of her own room, the way she admitted most true things to herself eventually. And it was precisely because the feeling was real that she found herself considering seriously whether the kindest thing she could do for him was remove herself from the situation before her presence cost him something he couldn't easily repair. She was packing the small trunk that had carried her 1,400 miles, 3 shirts folded inside it that she'd been mending for the hands when Tom found her. He stood in the doorway of the tack room a long moment before speaking, And when he did, his voice was quieter than she'd heard it. "Going somewhere?" he asked. She kept her hands steady on the folding, though her voice when it came was not quite as steady as she wanted. "I heard what's being said in town," she told him. "About the two of us. I won't have your name dragged through it on my account, Tom. You've built something honest here over 15 years, and I won't be the reason it gets spoken of unkindly." He crossed the room and gently took the shirt from her hands, setting it back on the desk. "My name's survived worse than Coraline Rourke's tongue," he said. "What I won't survive easy is you deciding to leave without so much as asking me what I think ought to be done about it." Josephine looked up at him, and something in his face, direct and unguarded in a way she'd rarely seen, stopped whatever careful argument she'd prepared. "I didn't want to make it your burden," she said quietly. "It's already my burden," he said. "Has been since I paid Agatha for your room that first night. I made my choice then plain as anything, and I'd make it again tomorrow." His jaw tightened slightly. "What I won't do is watch you run off to spare me something I never asked to be spared from." The room was very quiet. Outside, one of the horses shifted in its stall, and the evening wind moved along the eaves. "Then what would you have me do?" she asked. "Because I confess I don't know the answer myself." "Stay," he said simply. "Let them talk. Let Pruitt and Rourke's wife and every idle tongue in Buffalo say whatever fool thing they please. And in the meantime," he paused, and something in his voice roughened slightly. "In the meantime, let me figure out the right way to ask you something I've been turning over for longer than I've let on." Josephine felt her breath catch, not from fear this time, but from something considerably warmer. She did not ask him to finish the thought that evening. She understood somehow that the moment wasn't quite ready yet, that he needed his own time to arrive at the words, the way he arrived at everything carefully, without haste. But she left the shirt on the desk and did not touch the trunk again that night. She did not run. Instead, over the following week, Josephine did the only thing she knew how to do when facing an argument built on rumor rather than fact. She gathered evidence. She began keeping a formal ledger of her lessons, names and dates and progress, written in her clean, deliberate hand. Eli Vance letters through full sentences 6 weeks. Dutch Harmon could read a bill of sale unaided as of October. 3 other hands, besides each entry, precise, unembellished, the plain record of work actually done. She was not building a defense of her character, she told herself. She was building a record of competence, which was the only argument she had ever fully trusted. When she asked to appear again before the school board, Silas Pruitt's face showed the particular strain of a man who had hoped the matter had quietly resolved itself. He granted the meeting only because Ezra Dunn, the board's 3rd member, pressed for it, curious in his own quiet way about what the ranch schoolteacher had actually accomplished out past the coulee. She stood before the same table where Pruitt had turned her away in June, though the room felt different to her now, less like a place where her fate was decided, and more like a place where she intended to present facts. She laid the ledger open before them. "I understand the board had concerns in June about my suitability," she said. "I would ask only that you consider what I have actually done since. 6 men at Bracken Ranch, who could not read their own names in the spring, can now read contracts, letters, bills of sale. I would ask the board to judge me by that record rather than by whatever has been said about me in town since." Pruitt did not look at the ledger. Rourke glanced at it, and away again, uncomfortable. But Ezra Dunn leaned forward and studied the pages with real attention, running a finger down the list of names until it stopped. "My boy's name isn't here," he said, though there was no accusation in it, only curiosity. "Your son isn't one of Mr. Bracken's hands," Sir Josephine said. "But I would be glad to teach him or any child in this town exactly as I've taught these men, if the board would allow it." Dunn sat back, considering her for a long moment. "My Charlie's 11, he said slowly. "He's had no proper schooling since old Miss Hartley left 2 years back. I've been meaning to do something about that a good while now. He looked at Pruitt. "Silas, whatever you've heard from Coraline Rourke, or anybody else, this woman's put 6 grown men through their letters, working evenings in a tack shed with a single lamp. I don't see the harm the board was so worried about back in June." Pruitt's face had gone the color of old brick. "It isn't only about her competence," he said lower than before, as though he'd rather not say the rest of it aloud in front of her. "Then say what it is about," plainly Dunn said, and for the first time Josephine saw Pruitt's certainty falter the way it does when a man is asked to state a prejudice out loud rather than let it hide behind procedure. Pruitt did not answer directly. He shuffled the papers in front of him instead, and said the board would need time to deliberate properly, and the meeting ended without resolution, which was not victory, but was, Josephine understood, walking out into the cold afternoon, no longer quite the same defeat it had been in June either. She had made her case in the only language she trusted, fully, plain evidence honestly kept, and whatever the board decided now she had at least ensured the decision would have to be made in daylight, with her competence laid bare on the table, rather than in the shadow of a rumor no one was willing to name outright. Tom was waiting outside when she came out hat in hand, having deliberately stayed clear of the room itself. "How did it go?" he asked. "I told them the truth," she said, "and let them decide what to do with it. That's all any of us can do." He studied her face a moment, and something in his expression, admiration mixed with something warmer, still told her he understood exactly what that had cost her, and exactly what it meant that she had done it, without asking him to stand beside her while she did. The board's decision came 3 days later, delivered not by Pruitt, but by Ezra Dunn himself, who rode out to Bracken Ranch in the late afternoon, rather than send word through town, which Josephine understood even before he spoke as a kind of respect. "The boards voted 2-1, he told her, standing in the yard with his hat off. "You're to take on the schoolhouse come the new term in January, same salary Ellery Voss first offered you, and my Charlie'll be your first pupil enrolled if you'll have him." Josephine felt something in her chest release that had been held tight since June, a slow, quiet unclenching, rather than any sudden burst of joy. "And Mr. Pruitt?" she asked. "He was against it." "He was," Dunn said plainly. "Voted no, same as he said he would. But it was 2 votes to his 1, and Thaddeus Rourke came around once he'd had a chance to sit with the ledger a while and think past what his wife had been saying at church." Dunn's mouth twitched something close to a smile. Man doesn't like being seen standing against plain facts once they're laid out proper in front of him. She thanked him with real feeling, and he rode back toward town with the particular satisfaction of a man who had done something he believed in, and Josephine stood alone in the yard for a long moment, afterward letting the news settle into her, the way good news sometimes needs to be settled into slowly in stages. Tom found her there, when he came in from the far pasture, and read the news in her face before she said a word. "The school," he said. "It's yours." "It's mine," she confirmed, and something in her voice broke slightly on the word, not from sorrow, but from the sheer accumulated weight of everything since June finally setting down. He did not say anything further about the schoolhouse. Instead, he asked her to walk with him, and led her not toward the porch where they'd spent so many quiet evenings, but out along the fence line toward the coulee, where the last of the day's light lay gold and low across the grass. "I've been turning something over since that night." "You nearly packed your trunk," he said, stopping at the fence rail, his hands resting on the worn wood. "I told you I had something to ask once I found the right way to ask it." He turned to face her fully. "I don't know that there's ever a perfectly right way, so I'll just say it plain the way you'd want me to." She waited, her heart moving faster than she cared to admit. "I've watched you build something out of nothing since the day Pruitt turned you away," he said. "Watched you teach grown men to read by lamplight and stand in front of a board that didn't want to hear you and refused to let this town's meanness decide who you are." He paused, and something in his weathered face had gone entirely open, the guardedness she'd first met in June nowhere in it now. "I built a life out here that I stopped believing anyone would want to share. You've made me wonder if I was wrong about that. Josephine felt her breath catch. Tom, she said softly, I'm not asking you to answer tonight, he said. I know you've got a schoolhouse to settle into come January, and I won't crowd that with anything more than it needs. But I wanted you to know plainly what I've been carrying, same as I told you about Margaret. I'd like to court you properly, Josephine Calloway, if you'll allow it. Not because you've nowhere else to go. Because I can't rightly picture this place without you in it anymore. She looked at him in the fading gold light, this quiet, careful man who had said 7 words to a stranger at a boarding house counter and had been building ever since toward this much larger sentence. I would like that very much, she said, and the words came out steadier than she expected, certain in the way she said most things once she had fully decided them. They were married the following June, a year, almost to the week since Josephine Calloway had stepped off the Cheyenne stage with nowhere to go. The ceremony was small, held in the Buffalo Community Church, that had once hosted the very women's circle where Coraline Rourke's careless worry had first taken root, though Coraline herself attended, and offered a stiff, sincere congratulation afterward, which Josephine accepted graciously, understanding that a town's opinion could shift as honestly as a person's given enough plain evidence and enough time. Agatha Coyle stood as witness, dabbing at her eyes with the particular gruffness of a woman unused to public sentiment. Eli Vance, grown steadier and taller over the winter, read a short passage aloud from the front of the church, without a single stumble, a gift he had insisted on giving them himself, and Josephine watched him do it, with a pride that had nothing to do with the wedding, and everything to do with a letter written to a mother in Ohio the autumn before. The schoolhouse had opened in January exactly as promised, and by June it held 11 pupils, including Ezra Dunn's son Charlie, and on occasional evenings 2 of the ranch hands who came to sit quietly in the back row long after their letters no longer needed correcting, simply because the lamplight and the plain wooden desks had become for them, too, a kind of home. Josephine kept the schoolhouse and the ranch, both after the wedding riding, in each morning, along the same road she'd once walked. In despair, though the despair itself had long since faded into something closer to memory, softened at the edges, the way old grief softens when it's been folded properly into a life that turned out well. 5 years on the porch, at what was now simply called the Bracken Place, held 3 chairs instead of 2. And on a warm evening in early autumn, Josephine sat in the middle one with a small girl asleep against her shoulder. Dark-haired, serious-eyed, even in sleep, while Tom sat beside her mending a bridle with the same economical patience he brought to everything. The kitchen window, the one she'd insisted on when they'd added the new room the second year, faced east, the way she had told him once without quite explaining why it mattered that she would like it to. Every morning now the first sun came through that window and lay warm across the table where she graded her pupils' slates before the day's teaching began. And she had never told Tom directly what that small, deliberate choice meant to her. The quiet correction of an old wound from a letter written by a man who had never meant to keep his promises at all. She had not needed to explain it. Tom Bracken was not a man who required every feeling spelled out in words. He noticed the things that mattered, and let his noticing be its own kind of understanding, which she had learned over 5 years, was simply how he loved. I was thinking today, she said quietly, not to wake the sleeping girl, about the day I got off that stage with nothing but a trunk and a letter that turned out to be worthless. Tom's hands did not stop their work on the bridle, but his eyes came up to meet hers. Best worthless letter I ever heard of, he said, since it's the reason you ended up standing in that board office where I could see you. She smiled at that, the small private smile she reserved only for him. I had nowhere left to go that day, she said. I remember thinking it exactly in those words. Nowhere left to go. And I told you to come home with me, he said. Plain as he'd said it that first night, though it took me a fair while longer to work up to saying what I meant by home. She reached over and rested her hand on his, the same gesture she'd first offered on this same porch nearly 5 years before, close and certain and entirely unhurried. Outside, the light was going gold over Antelope Coulee, the way it had gone gold that very first evening. She'd walked this land as a stranger, with nothing to her name but a trunk and a wounded kind of hope. The house behind them was warm and full, and entirely finally hers as much as his. It was not the house Ellery Voss's letter had once promised her, and it was better because it had been built the slow, honest way out of lamplight and patience and a man who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was.